On Mother's Day, my daughter handed her mother-in-law a velvet box with a $20,000 ring inside, and when it was my turn, she smiled and gave me a $5 plastic bracelet like it meant the same thing. Everyone at the table clapped when Patricia opened her gift, the sunlight catching the diamond as if it had its own spotlight, and Emily stood beside her beaming with pride, one hand resting gently on her mother-in-law's shoulder like she had just fulfilled some lifelong duty, while I sat there holding a small pastel box that felt almost weightless in my hands, so light it was hard to believe it contained anything at all. I waited until the room quieted, until someone finally glanced in my direction, and then I opened it, slow and careful, the way I used to open the handmade cards Emily brought home from elementary school, except this time there was no glitter, no crooked handwriting, just a thin plastic bracelet with a faded gold tint that looked like it came from a clearance bin. "It's symbolic," Emily said with a soft laugh, as if that explained everything, as if meaning could replace effort, as if I wouldn't notice the difference between something chosen and something dismissed. I smiled because that's what I've always done, because raising a daughter alone for most of her life had taught me that sometimes silence carries more dignity than questions, and I placed the bracelet gently back in the box, nodding like I understood, even though something inside me had already started to shift. The restaurant was one of those upscale places downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and servers who refilled your water before you realized you needed it, and I had spent the morning getting ready, choosing a soft blue dress Emily once told me made me look elegant, curling my hair just enough to feel presentable, telling myself this day mattered, that it still meant something to her, but as I watched her lean in close to Patricia, adjusting the ring on her finger, explaining the cruise she had booked for the two of them, I realized I wasn't part of that moment at all. Daniel chimed in about the itinerary, something about 7 days in the Caribbean, ocean views, private dinners, and Patricia laughed, a warm, satisfied sound that filled the space between them, while my side of the table stayed quiet, untouched, like an afterthought no one quite knew how to include. I picked up my glass of iced tea and took a small sip, letting the condensation chill my fingers, grounding myself in something real, something steady, because if I focused too much on the contrast, on the numbers, on the way my daughter's voice softened when she spoke to someone else's mother, I might have said something I couldn't take back. Instead, I watched, I listened, and I remembered, not just this moment, but others like it, small things at first, easy to excuse, easy to overlook, until they weren't small anymore. Emily turned to me then, her expression bright, almost rehearsed, and asked if I liked my gift, and I met her eyes, searching for something familiar, something that reminded me of the little girl who used to wrap wildflowers in napkins and call them presents, but all I found was a polite expectation, like she had already decided what my answer should be. "It's lovely," I said, my voice steady, because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me measure my worth against a price tag, not yet, not here, not in front of an audience that had already decided where I belonged. And as the conversation moved on without me, as the laughter rose and fell around the table, I realized something quietly, something that settled in my chest with a calm I hadn't expected. They thought they had defined my value with a $5 piece of plastic. And for the first time, I didn't feel small, I felt clear. I left the restaurant before dessert was served, not because I was upset, at least not in any way that showed, but because I had learned a long time ago that staying too long in a place where you do not belong only makes the silence louder. And as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon air felt cooler than it should have for May. Or maybe it was just me finally noticing the difference between warmth that is real and warmth that is performed. I walked to my car slowly, taking my time, the small box still in my purse, untouched since I had closed it at the table, and for a moment I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror, the same face that had aged quietly over the years, the same eyes that had watched a little girl grow into a woman who now measured love in dollars and destinations. It was not always like this, or at least that is what I used to believe, but memories have a way of rearranging themselves when you look at them from the right angle, and as I drove home through familiar streets, I began to see things I had missed before, small moments that once felt harmless, now fitting together with a clarity that was almost unsettling. There was the time Emily canceled Thanksgiving at the last minute because Daniel's family had already made plans, and I told myself it made sense, that marriage meant compromise, even though I ended up eating alone at my kitchen table with more food than I could finish. And there was the Christmas when she said they wanted something quiet and intimate, just the two of them, only for me to see photos later of a full house filled with Daniel's relatives, laughter frozen in pictures I was never meant to be part of. At the time, I explained it away, told myself not to be sensitive, not to make everything about me, because that is what mothers do. We adjust, we give, we step back so our children can step forward, but somewhere along the way, stepping back turned into disappearing, and I had not noticed when the shift became permanent. When I got home, the house greeted me the way it always did, quiet but familiar, every corner holding something I had built over decades, not with grand gestures, but with consistency, with effort, with choices that put someone else first more times than I could count, and I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, took off my shoes, and moved through the space without turning on the television, without filling the silence, because for once, I wanted to hear it clearly. I opened the small box again, studying the bracelet under the kitchen light, the plastic catching just enough shine to pretend it was something more, and I thought about how easy it is to create the appearance of value without the substance, how something can look acceptable from a distance if no one looks too closely, and I set it down gently, not with anger, but with a kind of understanding that felt sharper than any disappointment. Emily had not changed overnight, and neither had I, but the difference between us had been growing quietly, decision by decision, moment by moment, until it became something neither of us could ignore, even if only one of us was willing to see it. And as I stood there in my kitchen, the light humming softly above me, I realized that what happened at that table was not an isolated moment. It was a reflection, a clear and undeniable one, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to explain it away. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleep no longer held the same comfort it used to, and as the first light came through the kitchen window, I found myself standing at the counter with a cup of coffee I had not yet tasted, staring at nothing in particular while my mind moved quietly through the past like it was sorting through a drawer that had been left untouched for too long. I thought about Emily as a child, the way she used to sit at that very table swinging her legs, asking questions about everything, trusting that I would always have the answer, and I remembered how I worked late shifts just to keep that sense of stability for her, how I told myself every sacrifice was an investment in her future, something that would come back not in money, but in respect, in connection, in the kind of bond that does not need to be proven because it is simply there. But somewhere along the way, that return never came, or maybe it came in forms I refused to recognize, because it was easier to believe in intention than to face reality. Around mid-morning, my phone rang, and I saw her name on the screen, bright and familiar, and for a moment I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to feel the space between us clearly, to understand what had changed without filling it too quickly. "Mom," she said, her voice light, almost casual, as if yesterday had been just another lunch, as if nothing needed to be explained, and I could hear background noise, the faint sound of movement. Maybe dishes, maybe conversation, something that told me she was not alone. She asked if I had made it home safely, if I liked the restaurant, small questions that hovered on the surface without ever touching what mattered, and I answered simply, evenly, giving her nothing more than what she asked for, because I was beginning to understand that she was not looking for depth, she was looking for confirmation that everything was still in place. Then she laughed softly and said, "Patricia loved the ring, you should have seen her face," and there was a pause, just long enough for me to respond, just long enough for me to agree, to play my part, but I did not fill it the way I used to. "I saw," I said, and my voice did not waver, did not rise, did not carry any of the weight I felt, because I was no longer interested in teaching her how to treat me better through reactions she had already learned to ignore. She moved on quickly, talking about the cruise, about dates and plans, about how busy things were going to be, and as she spoke, I realized that in her version of events, there was no imbalance, no oversight, no quiet dismissal. There was only a narrative where everything made sense, where everyone had their place, and I knew then that if I wanted to understand what was really happening, I would have to step outside that narrative entirely. After the call ended, I set my phone down and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one I rarely used except for bills and occasional paperwork, and I opened the drawer where I kept old documents, bank statements, records that had accumulated over the years without much thought, and for the first time, I looked at them not as routine, but as pieces of a larger picture. I noticed transfers I had not paid attention to before, small amounts at first, then larger ones, times when I had helped Emily with something, covered an expense, sent money without asking too many questions because she was my daughter and that was what I did. And I began to wonder how many of those decisions had been one-sided, how many had been expected rather than appreciated. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of paper shifting as I moved through it, and with each page, the feeling inside me did not grow louder, it grew clearer, more defined, like something that had been blurred was finally coming into focus. And I understood that what I had witnessed yesterday was not just about a gift, it was about a pattern, one that had been there long before I was ready to see it, and one that I could no longer pretend did not exist. As the afternoon sun streamed through the living room windows, I sat in the armchair I had chosen years ago, the one with the worn cushion that fit me perfectly, and I let my mind drift over the years of Emily's life, noticing again the subtle ways she had learned to navigate situations to her advantage. I remembered how I would wake early to prepare breakfast for her before school, making sure her favorite cereal was ready, her lunch packed just the way she liked it, and how she would run out the door with a smile that always felt genuine, yet somehow, over time, I began to see a pattern I had once dismissed as coincidence. Small acts, almost invisible at first, like choosing to spend more time with her mother-in-law than with me during holidays, arranging family dinners in ways that made my presence less central, praising Patricia openly for things I had done for Emily countless times. All of it formed a quiet but unmistakable web. I traced my finger along the edge of the coffee table as if to connect the dots that had lain scattered across years of interactions, each memory a thread tying together moments I had once believed were innocent or trivial, and I saw that the effort, the attention, the thought I had given freely had not always been recognized, had not always been valued, and yet it had shaped the woman sitting in front of me yesterday, holding a bracelet in her hand as if it could measure the love and respect she owed me. I took a deep breath, noticing the rhythm of the house, the way the shadows lengthened on the hardwood floor, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, all ordinary sounds that underlined the extraordinary realization settling over me, that my relationship with Emily had shifted gradually, imperceptibly, until the foundation I had assumed was solid was now something I had to evaluate on my own terms. I reflected on the quiet mornings when she would call just to ask for advice, the evenings I spent helping her with projects, the holidays when I rearranged my schedule to accommodate her friends and her in-laws, and I realized that each of these moments, though given with love, had also been opportunities for her to practice the skill of prioritization in a way that did not include me. Yet I did not feel anger in the way one expects, I felt clarity, a sense of watching a play unfold where I had once been an actor but now was an observer, capable of noticing the subtleties that had escaped me before. I understood that I could continue to perform my role as if nothing had changed, or I could take the knowledge I had gathered and allow it to guide my actions moving forward. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the warmth in my hands, and the quiet determination that had been growing inside me over the last day became something tangible, something that could inform each choice I made from now on, each interaction I had with Emily and Patricia, each event, each small gesture, measured carefully and consciously, and in that calm, steady space, I recognized the beginning of a shift, subtle but powerful, one that would let me see clearly what was coming and prepare for the moments when I would act not out of reaction, but out of intent. By mid-afternoon, the quiet in my house had settled into a rhythm I could almost feel, the soft ticking of the wall clock marking each deliberate second as if it were counting more than time, counting moments of clarity that I had begun to gather like scattered notes on a sheet of music, each one hinting at a pattern I had overlooked. I moved to the kitchen, placing a mug of warm herbal tea on the counter, the steam curling gently into the air, and I allowed myself to review the interactions from the previous day in my mind, each word and gesture from Emily and Patricia replaying with new significance, revealing the subtle ways in which I had been edged out of the center of family life without noticing until now. I remembered the dinner, the laughter, the exchanges that had seemed casual but now felt orchestrated, and I realized how often the small details had been used to shape perception, to create the illusion of fairness while quietly prioritizing Patricia, and the bracelet in my hand became more than plastic, it became a symbol of the imbalance that had existed for years. I opened my laptop and began to look through old emails and messages, noting patterns, moments where resources were diverted or decisions made without consultation. Each instance a thread in the web that Emily had spun so carefully that I had almost believed it was natural, that she had no other intention than love or care. And I realized that recognition alone gave me power, clarity that could not be taken away. I reflected on the holidays, the birthdays, the celebrations where my presence had been minimized, the times when I had offered help or gifts and received little acknowledgement, and I recognized that these were not isolated acts, but a consistent approach, one that now allowed me to anticipate her behavior rather than be surprised by it. I felt neither bitterness nor despair, only a measured understanding that change was possible, that I could adjust the way I engaged, the way I contributed, the way I responded, and I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into my hands, grounding me in a sense of purpose. I moved to the living room window and looked out at the street below, noticing the familiar landscape with new eyes, seeing what had been invisible before because I had trusted too fully in routines and intentions, and in that moment I felt a quiet determination, a steady resolve to act with intention and awareness rather than reaction, to create situations that reflected fairness and respect, and to observe how Emily would respond when her usual assumptions were challenged. Each thought was deliberate, measured, and precise, like a careful hand arranging pieces on a chessboard, understanding that patience and observation could achieve more than immediate confrontation, and I felt a subtle satisfaction in that realization, knowing that awareness itself could be a tool, a safeguard, and a beginning of something controlled and deliberate. I set the mug down and let my gaze linger on the small details around me, each one a reminder of the life I had built, the care I had given, and the discernment I now possessed, understanding that the power of quiet observation often exceeded the impact of words, and that from this point forward, every decision I made could be intentional, every interaction carefully measured, and every response a reflection of the understanding I had gained from the subtle but unmistakable signals that had been present all along. By early evening, the light in the house had softened, the long shadows stretching across the hardwood floor, and I found myself moving from room to room with a quiet deliberateness, noticing the details I had once overlooked, the way the furniture caught the dim glow of the setting sun, the slight hum of the air conditioning, the familiar scent of brewing coffee lingering from earlier, each ordinary element now carrying an almost symbolic weight. I opened the kitchen drawer where I kept the important papers, the old envelopes, the receipts, and I began sorting through them methodically, making note of every transaction, every gift, every time a request had been made and met with compliance on my part. And as I reviewed each line, I started to see a pattern that had been invisible in the flurry of daily life, a pattern that spoke of choices made for convenience, for appearances, for personal advantage, and not always with consideration for my role in the family. Emily had grown up surrounded by love and attention, yet the way she navigated relationships now, the way she prioritized certain connections over others, revealed a skill that had been honed quietly over the years. And I understood that observing this skill gave me insight that could be used with careful precision. I poured a fresh cup of tea and carried it to the living room, placing it on the side table, and I sat down, letting the warmth seep into my hands while I reflected on the subtleties of yesterday, the timing of compliments, the calculated pauses, the way gestures could convey both generosity and disregard, depending on the intention behind them. I thought about the moments when I had been generous without expectation, when I had offered assistance or support because it was my nature to do so, and how those moments were sometimes absorbed as entitlements by others, reshaping the dynamics in ways I had not anticipated. It was not resentment I felt, but clarity, a calm understanding of the landscape that had been forming quietly around me, and I realized that the next steps I took could be measured and purposeful, informed by observation rather than emotion, guided by an awareness that had been hard-won through reflection and careful attention. I moved to the desk near the window, opened the ledger where I had been noting patterns in interactions, and added new observations, small details that had emerged from the previous day, each one a piece of the mosaic I was assembling, and as I worked, I felt a growing sense of readiness, a quiet power that comes from understanding a situation completely before making a move. The house remained still except for the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional distant sound of traffic, and in that stillness I found an unexpected satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you are seeing clearly, from recognizing the subtle currents that have guided relationships, and from understanding that careful patience and deliberate action can achieve more than hasty confrontation. I sipped my tea again, feeling grounded, and I knew that the days ahead could be approached with strategy, observation, and intent, with each interaction now an opportunity to assert presence and awareness, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the steady confidence that comes from knowing the truth and preparing to navigate it with precision. I spent the morning moving deliberately through the house, tidying areas that rarely needed attention, arranging small objects with care, each motion measured and deliberate, noticing the way the sunlight fell across the shelves, catching the edges of picture frames, illuminating the years of memories stored there, and I allowed myself to consider the interactions that had occurred over the past days, seeing them as a sequence rather than isolated events, a chain of gestures and choices that together painted a portrait of intention. I reflected on Emily's behavior, the subtle ways she had cultivated the perception of generosity while diverting attention and resources in ways that reinforced her own priorities, and I thought about how these patterns had been invisible to me until yesterday, only noticeable when examined with the calm and focus that comes from stepping back and observing without the distraction of emotion. I made a note of each instance, writing them in a notebook, not as complaints but as data, evidence of the consistent ways my presence had been minimized and my contributions overlooked, and I considered how this knowledge could inform the way I interacted with both Emily and Patricia in the future. I remembered the small gestures of earlier years, the thoughtful notes, the homemade meals, the careful planning for holidays and birthdays, and how each had been given freely and without expectation, and I understood that the absence of acknowledgement in return did not diminish their value, but it did reveal how much power could be wielded simply by controlling perception. I brewed a fresh cup of tea and carried it to the living room, allowing the warmth to settle in my hands, and I let my gaze rest on the family photos displayed along the mantel, the images of past generations, the moments of joy, the smiles that had once seemed permanent and unchanging, and I realized that these photographs were reminders that context matters, that the environment shapes how we experience relationships, and that awareness of the environment gives one the ability to act strategically. I considered the small daily routines, the seemingly inconsequential decisions that had gradually shifted the dynamics in the household, and I recognized that understanding these patterns allowed for intervention in a controlled and thoughtful manner, without rash action or unnecessary confrontation. As I reviewed the details, the gestures, and the interactions, I felt a sense of calm empowerment, knowing that observation and preparation could be as powerful as immediate reaction, and that by carefully choosing when and how to engage, I could assert influence and set boundaries that had previously been overlooked. I sipped my tea, appreciating the silence that surrounded me, the quiet clarity that had settled over the house, and I understood that patience, awareness, and measured responses would guide the coming days, allowing me to navigate the family dynamics with precision and subtlety, ensuring that my presence, contributions, and expectations were recognized on my terms rather than assumed or taken for granted. The evening settled into a gentle quiet, the light dimming through the living room windows as I moved slowly, almost ritualistically, through the space, noting the familiar contours of the furniture, the subtle texture of the curtains, and the way shadows stretched across the floorboards like long, deliberate brushstrokes. I carried with me a sense of measured awareness, each step deliberate, each movement thoughtful, as if I were both participant and observer in the unfolding story of my own home. At the desk, I reviewed the notes I had compiled over the previous days, a collection of small actions, overlooked gestures, and subtle patterns that together painted a portrait of intention and behavior, and I traced the connections carefully, making sense of the choices that had shaped interactions between Emily, Patricia, and myself. The sound of the refrigerator hum and the ticking clock became a steady backdrop to my thoughts, grounding me in the present while allowing my mind to examine past events with precision, noting how small omissions and unspoken decisions had gradually shifted the balance in the household without my awareness. I thought of the mornings I had spent preparing breakfast, the afternoons helping with homework or coordinating family activities, and the countless ways I had supported Emily, each act given freely, yet now appearing in hindsight as part of a larger dynamic where acknowledgement and appreciation had been selectively directed. I reflected on the subtle techniques she had learned, consciously or unconsciously, to create perceptions of fairness and generosity that often left me on the periphery, and I considered how this insight could inform my approach moving forward, emphasizing observation and intentional action over immediate response. I poured another cup of tea, the warmth comforting in my hands, and allowed myself a quiet examination of the environment, seeing clearly the ways in which everyday moments had accumulated into a recognizable pattern, a pattern that offered both understanding and control. The framed photographs along the mantel caught the fading light, each image a reminder of continuity and the passage of time, grounding me in the reality that awareness, careful attention, and deliberate engagement were tools as potent as any outward gesture. I thought about the upcoming days, the interactions that would come, the choices I would make regarding presence, attention, and contribution, and I felt a steady confidence, a sense of power that derived not from confrontation but from clarity and preparation. Every detail, from the placement of objects to the timing of conversations, could now be considered strategically, each opportunity to engage measured against the knowledge I had gathered and the understanding I had cultivated. The quiet of the evening allowed these thoughts to crystallize, shaping a framework for action that was deliberate, precise, and composed, providing a foundation for how I would navigate future interactions with Emily and Patricia, asserting my presence and ensuring that my contributions, expectations, and dignity would be recognized without the need for unnecessary conflict or dramatics, and in this calm, measured state, I found both resolve and the beginnings of a plan that would guide my decisions with subtlety and authority. The following morning, the sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the living room as I sat at the edge of the sofa, a notebook open on my lap and a pen poised in my hand, ready to record the insights and observations that had crystallized over the past days. I reflected on the patterns I had seen, the repeated prioritization of Patricia over my own presence, and how Emily's choices, once subtle, now revealed a consistent strategy of influence that had shaped interactions and expectations within the family. I carefully listed the instances, small and large, noting the gestures, the timing, and the responses that had highlighted the disparity, and in doing so, I began to see a framework for action, a sequence of decisions that could be made deliberately rather than reactively. I sipped a cup of warm herbal tea, feeling its gentle heat settle into my hands, and I allowed myself to imagine how upcoming gatherings could be approached differently, considering each detail from seating arrangements to the flow of conversation, the placement of gifts, and the subtle cues that guide attention and recognition. I thought about the moments when Emily had unconsciously revealed her assumptions, the times she had allowed her focus to drift to Patricia, and I realized that these were opportunities to reassert presence quietly, to shift perceptions without confrontation, and to create situations where fairness and acknowledgement could not be overlooked. I reviewed the family calendar, noting upcoming events, and I began to plan small, intentional gestures that would demonstrate consideration and respect for all members of the household, ensuring that my contributions were visible and meaningful. Each action was to be measured, each interaction deliberate, balancing patience with discernment, and allowing the natural unfolding of events to reveal the dynamics that had previously been hidden. I paused to look around the room, noticing the familiar photographs, the way light reflected off the polished surfaces, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator, grounding myself in the reality that careful observation and preparation were tools as valuable as any overt statement. I reflected on the way power can be exercised through subtlety, through the orchestration of environment and attention, and how the awareness of patterns allows for influence without conflict, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the next steps would be taken with purpose, guided by understanding rather than reaction. I considered the family dinners, the holidays, and the casual interactions, imagining how minor adjustments in timing, wording, and focus could communicate value and acknowledgement, ensuring that contributions were recognized and that oversight would no longer be taken for granted. In that calm, steady state, I felt prepared to navigate the days ahead with clarity, ensuring that observation, intention, and strategic engagement would guide my interactions, creating a balance that reflected both presence and authority. And I understood that the subtle application of awareness could achieve far more than confrontation ever could, providing a foundation for respect, recognition, and quiet empowerment that would shape the family dynamics in meaningful and lasting ways.